The common mistakes are first doing it alone without full alignment and buy-in from the rest of the executive team. The single best thing I think that the CMO can do is to enlist the head of sales and also the head of post-sale if they exist. If there's an operations leader that's a C-level leader, set the expectation that the quantity is likely to go down. The quality will go up and the conversion rate will go up, right? If people don't expect that just the numbers will be lower, you can run into a buzzsaw and get into trouble.
I'm Brian Carroll. Today with me is our guest, Jon Miller. So I met Jon first way back in 2006 when he founded Marketo, and he really helped build the marketing automation category as we know it today. Now he's building Phave, which is an AI native marketing automation platform. Jon didn't just build the next thing and quietly move on like a lot of founders did. He's gone back and started diagnosing what the challenges and problems were with something that he previously created. He's talking about what's wrong, why is it failing buyers today? So Jon, I wanted to talk to you. When did you first start thinking about the MQL model was broken or not working? How did you get there?
It started really more than anything else on my time at Demandbase. So after we merged Engagio and Demandbase together in 2020, first thing I did is I helped on the product team to unify the two platforms together. But then in 2021, I took over as CMO. And, I had my playbook for, this is how I do it. I create, definitive guides, big, rich, meaty pieces of content. You run lots of other thought leadership like webinars, and you generate leads from all those things. And most of those leads won't be ready to buy right now. And that's okay. That's why you nurture them and score them. A little something about that. And then eventually when they are ready, you kind of pass them to sales. And that was the playbook. And it's the playbook that I ran at Marketo. And to a degree, it's the playbook I also somewhat ran at Engagio, although we also layered on an account-based motion at Engagio too that we'll get to. So here I am at Demandbase and running that playbook, and just the exact same tactics that worked for me at Marketo weren't working at Demandbase. It felt like at Marketo I'd had a tailwind that was pushing me forward and making everything work better. And at Demandbase, it felt like, bicycling into a headwind. And that's what got me thinking like, okay, what's going on here? And over the course of time, I diagnosed multiple problems, right? I mean, like most things that in the world that are complex, many reasons why it didn't work, but it related to more than anything else. I think one, buyer saturation, two, the fact that the traditional model missed out on important things like brand, and then three, the fact that the MQL, as I alluded to, is really focused on people and not accounts. So we can dive into any or all three of those.
I want to understand what you felt or noticed was broken first. Like, what did this model of how you're approaching MQLs, as you've reflected on or as you've done research, what are we getting wrong about how buyers buy today?
Yeah, well, let's start with the core philosophy behind the MQL, which is, that you can run a campaign, and get a meaningful response that will be valuable on the other side of that. That's how we thought of it at Marketo. And if I needed more MQLs, the response naturally was, well, then let's run more campaigns. And it's, it sort of trained us to think of buying like a gumball machine. Put your quarter in, get your gumball out. Put your campaign in, get your MQL out. And the reality is, like, I just don't actually think that's the way buying works. Now, arguably, early days of Marketo, simpler buying committees, heavy demand, lots of latent need for a product, okay, maybe you could argue it. There was elements where it worked then, but now you fast forward today, buying is just, we know it is much more complex. There are 6 to 16 members of the buying committee, not one person. As you talked about in the intro, that whole buying committee is going through a very complex set of research that's happening, not just on our website, but increasingly off our website in closed communities and talking to AI agents and other things that are just invisible to the traditional tracking mechanisms, and so when you have this complexity there, I think the model of marketing as a simple linear gumball machine starts to break down. And, Kathleen Schwab, I think, formed a really good term for this, which then I connected to my math and physics, education, right? She called it marketing in the great big messy world. And she pointed out that, marketing is actually a very complex, nonlinear process, not a simple linear gumball machine. And, I studied complex nonlinear processes in college, and turns out, that's the origin of what's now called chaos theory. The weather is a complex nonlinear process. The stock market is a complex nonlinear process. And complex nonlinear processes, amongst other things, are known for their unpredictability. The sensitive dependence upon initial conditions, the fact that a butterfly flapping its wing in Brazil can cause the hurricane in Japan. Most people have heard that one.
That's right.
If you embrace the fundamental idea that buying is just as complex as the weather, it means that it's a completely impossible task to basically say, well, I run this one campaign and that's going to lead to buying happen. Or, well, where did this deal come from? Oh, well, that's because they stopped by the booth at the trade show. No, that it is a much more complex system than any of those things can really, I think, make meaningful.
Well, the gumball machine analogy, I think you're hitting on something that people are struggling with that I want to talk to you about. Attribution is something that marketers, the MQL, is now elevated to the board, where board members or CEOs, and it's because it's a KPI. It's a visible KPI. And I think there's a lot of misses with the way we think about it because we actually don't know how many MQLs actually become real customers, and because of what you just talked about with how buyers buy. What have you thought about people can be doing differently than do marketing qualified leads? And you had something I read on LinkedIn. You wrote about this 3-tiered model. You talked about this marketing engaged layer and how people are consuming content, but they aren't showing buying signals yet. And then most demand gen teams would say those are the ones that aren't worth chasing because they don't showing that level of buying intent yet. They've just engaged something. And can you make a case why that's wrong? Or why exactly is that the place you think the fight is getting lost?
I think it's worse by starting by saying that there was some goodness in the original concept of the MQL. Specifically that it was a contract between marketing and sales, where marketing said, "I'm only going to pass you things that reach this bar." That there's strong evidence that is, this is worthy of sales attention. And similarly, sales would basically say, okay, I commit to this level and service level agreement for follow-up. And that was a really good thing about the MQL. And, the problems over time, it got bastardized. As people were under pressure to hit pipeline targets, some marketing teams gamed the scoring thresholds. I saw so many companies who basically said any responder to any campaign was an MQL, and I'm like, that's not what it was. But that's behavior that was driven by this desire for more MQLs, is exactly what led to sales starting to cherry pick, ignoring most of the MQLs.
Mm-hmm.
So what was sales cherry picking? They were cherry picking hand raisers, which, and I've talked to some CMOs who said that's the only thing now we report. Our hand raisers. So hand raisers are people explicitly asking for a sales connect. That does make sense. Like, these are people that you want to talk to. It is, I think, 100% too passive. And as you've alluded to a couple times, it's too late. If you only wait for somebody to come raise their hand, you are by definition only talking to the 5% of people in market. And those people will have already created and aligned on their shortlists without you, which means that you are column B and at best, fighting an uphill battle. Mike Bosworth wrote Solution Selling a while ago, and there's a lot of wisdom in that old book, if you will. The idea of solution selling is that, helping a buyer see pain that they haven't prioritized, bringing that latent pain to an active evaluation is a really valuable thing. And if you can be the vendor guiding that process, you help to shape the buying criteria. So the question is, how do we make that happen? I mean, one of the ways that you make that happen is with an investment in branding, building a brand that both helps create urgency around the problem you're solving, as well as connection between your company and the ability to solve that pain, as well as positive feelings around that connection, is incredibly valuable. And we could do a whole other podcast, I think, about branding. But there is the element of how do you tie in this like idea of solution selling with the goodness that the MQL brought to the table? Because solution selling gone wrong just becomes cold calling, and that's not good for anybody. And that's why I came up with the 3-tier model that you just referred to. And so in my 3-tier model, the top tier is, of course, hand raisers. Right? Let's just all agree that's the gold standard. At the end of the day, that's what sales wants more than anything else. And let's track it. But then I had 2 other tiers. Tier 2, I called MQX. The X is really important here because I think oftentimes having the X be lead is not the right answer unless you have a low value, highly transactional purchase that can be done by a single person. Most of the time, it is a much more complex buying committee. So I generally would say tier 2 should be MQA, marketing qualified account, or maybe even an MQBG, the marketing qualified buying group. As a sidebar, MQBG sounds like a mouthful, so I usually just drop the M from that one and just call it a QBG. Anyways, what these all have in common is that there's some signal that makes you think that there is a pretty good chance that this account or this buying group is actually in that kind of evaluation buying stage. Either starting to kind of form their shortlist or consensus. Maybe they already have, but you're kind of not waiting for them to reach out and raise their hand. I think if you can reach out, though, to those companies at that right time in the right way, it can be valuable. The key is, MQX does not mean this person is ready to buy. It means marketing believes, based on the data, that we think this account might be in market. And there's interesting debate whether we should not call this one qualified, because it's not qualified in the way the salesperson uses that word.
Right.
And so I like using it because I think it's a mental model is familiar, but I think you could also call it a marketing recommended account or a marketing indicated account. If the qualified keyword at your company has baggage, then fine. Something else is good. All right, so that was a mouthful. Then I had my 3rd tier, which I called MEX, or marketing engaged account, if you will. This is really the 95% that are not in market, and you could cold call into that 95. But the idea of MEX, as opposed to just your target account list, that it's somebody from your target account list, if you will, but at least they're also engaging with your brand and ideas. There's some level of engagement, even if they're not buying signals. They're showing interest, at least in your topic, if they're not showing intent to purchase. Right? Odds are that will be a warmer outreach than just truly a cold call. But 100% do not reach out to that person and pitch them a demo or a sales meeting. This is about doing what Bosworth calls good old solution selling. Helping them to understand and quantify the costs of the status quo, to create hope about what the future could be, perhaps by sharing examples of what other companies have been doing. That is not the way typical SDRs reach out today. It is a mano a mano, one-on-one way of building brand, of building awareness, that a person with sales in front of their title might not be the right person to do that, which is why some companies have MDRs or market development reps. But that means you need different economics, different compensation strategies. You can't pay an MDR, on this quarter's pipeline if what they're doing is planting seeds for a year from now.
That's right.
So anyway, that was a lot of talking about the framework. But I think hand raisers, MQX, MEX makes a lot of sense.
Well, a lot of things were going on in my head as I was listening to, because, one, you brought up brand. You talked about this notion of how do we think about engaging differently. And then you even talked about how SDRs, the current playbook, which is an SDR follows up on a scored lead, And they're incentivized one way, which is to either get a demo, schedule an appointment. So they're looking at things that are last mile or towards the end of the buying process. And majority of the leads they're going to talk to are nowhere close to that. They're just in early stages. So I wanted to hear, as you've been digging into this through CMO dinners that you've been having, as you've been talking to CMOs and what you're seeing in the space, how are CMOs responding to this right now? Like in terms of what are you seeing, what are you hearing, what do you think teams need to do right now to get them from where they are now, this whole idea of this marketing qualified lead, to where they need to go?
I see a wide variance in how different marketing leaders are responding to some of these pressures. This is a dramatic oversimplification. You can bucket most marketing leaders that I see out there into either a strategic CMO category or a tactical CMO category. The tactical CMOs, whether they want to be or not, work at companies that primarily view marketing as pipeline generation. And these CMOs are being forced to or pressured into working in a traditional playbook and reporting on traditional metrics. Like MQLs, like marketing sourced or marketing influenced pipeline. These CMOs will give the right kind of like acknowledgement. I know the MQLs aren't right. And I'm also reporting on these other things, but they still kind of like, yeah, but I have to report the MQLs. The strategic CMOs, I think, are the ones that are able to be elevating the role, that are the ones that first and foremost are executives of the company that are able to bring their understanding of the market and the customer. So that way they're in the room when strategic discussions are happening. It is the concept of the CMO as chief market officer as opposed to chief marketing officer. I think those CMOs are driving conversations around the changing buyer, around the importance of brand, on the need to think long-term, not just short-term.
Mhm.
And they're bringing, I think they would all agree that pipeline is permission. So even if you are a strategic CMO, if you're consistently missing pipeline, you do not have permission to go invest in the big new brand project. And they get that, but how they go tackle that and how they talk about it feels a little bit different. So that's probably the biggest delta, and it runs its way through into the dashboards they're presenting. How they interact with their peers. How often are they talking to the CFO, and what are they talking to the CFO about? All those types of good things.
It sounds like the more tactical CMOs are subjecting themselves more to this Gumball analogy that we talked about of MQLs, driving demand, being able to generate the numbers. And what you're saying is for the strategic CMO, it's not that they ignore those things. That's still important to be able to drive demand and see demand generation, but they're thinking bigger picture about building the strategy of how important brand is, for example, in B2B, which I want to talk about. One of the challenges I think all of us are dealing with right now in terms of not just the brand, but the technical environment we're operating in. I'd like to pivot around something, how AI is affecting this and changing what's possible, because I think whether you're a strategic or tactical CMO, it has a huge influence on what you're dealing with, this idea of this journey. Like, what can you do differently for these marketing engaged leads, for example? And how might we approach that?
I think that part of the problem is tools like Marketo, which obviously I helped to create, that were really built around a mental model of the MQL, of marketing as kind of a linear, simple buying process. In platforms like that, that are based on rules, very much if this, then that, you end up with static nurture paths that are, you're lucky if you have 2 or 3 different paths for 2 or 3 different personas, let alone really trying to understand what's the right thing for each person, in each account. I think when you embrace the sort of modern buying process where 95% are not ready to buy, where we need to be finding a way to, create that latent pain, keep in touch with that 95% of the market, and then find the signals when they might be becoming qualified, pre-hand raiser, but ready to reach out. The legacy tools like Marketo, I really just believe can't keep up. with what needs to happen in this new dynamic. I just alluded to the nurture tracks are just too rigid and too limited for really engaging with this broad set of the market before they're ready to buy. And honestly, they're also too email centric for when you don't have permission for a huge fraction of that database. The analogy that I like to think about is rather than putting people in specific nurture tracks, what we want is to create a personalized playlist for each person. And I like using playlists because people kind of understand Spotify, right? Like there's a whole library of songs, right? That it could play for you at any given time. But what their AI does is it thinks about me and it thinks about what I've liked and listened to in the past and engaged with them in the past, what I haven't listened to in a while. And it takes all the information and it knows about me and it makes a playlist for me. And even if you and I both like 80s songs, we're still going to get a different playlist because we're different people who've engaged with different things. So every single person in Spotify is getting a completely unique, personalized playlist for them that's engaging them. Can we use AI to apply that same idea to marketing? So for that 95% that aren't in market, right? But I need to engage with them over time. Let's craft a personalized playlist for each of them based on who they are, where they work at their company, what else is happening across their buying committee, and what we know about them. And yeah, if we have opt-in permission, that playlist should involve email touches, but it won't always. And maybe sometimes that's going to involve advertising. It might involve LinkedIn touches. It could be a whole variety of ways that we want to interact, by picking the right offer, the right channel, the right content, and the right time as we kind of craft these different playlists. Yeah. So legacy market automation is rule-based lists. It's too person-based, meaning you can't really think about playlists that look at the account level and go multi-channel into advertising. And one other thing I'll say, which we haven't really talked about, is the bias to our whole conversation so far has been really focused, I think, on net new business, acquiring the new customer, the new account. A lot of the concepts of hand raiser and MQX and EX, I think, can still apply also to post-sale, especially if we're doing expansion into new buying committees, as well as kind of product qualified leads or accounts, as well as product adoption type of campaigns. The legacy marketing automation tools don't handle any of that stuff well either. And I think, again, a new AI-enabled approaches, can. Which, not surprisingly, gives you a pretty big hint at what I'm trying to build at Phave.
So, Phave, that's what you're working on right now, is this idea of this AI-enabled marketing automation to deliver these personalized one-to-one journeys. And it sounds like the promise would be kind of like what I was reading way back, Peppers and Rogers one-to-one marketing, but that where we actually can do it in the same way you talked about the playlist. Is there anything else you'd want to add onto that?
It's funny you bring up Peppers and Rogers because at the intro for the podcast, you sort of said I'm an interesting entrepreneur that kind of has come back and revisited what I've done before. The way I describe my journey from Epiphany, the company before Marketo, which I wasn't a founder, but Epiphany to Marketo to Engagio and now to Phave, I've been on my journey to deliver on the one-to-one future. Each of those companies would have said, we're trying to do one-to-one marketing, and each of them got us closer, but not quite. And what I'm so excited about living, today in 2026 in the age of AI is I think finally, we will be able to deliver on what truly is one-to-one marketing as envisioned by Peppers and Rogers back in 1993.
Yeah, that vision has been around a long time, but it seems with every iteration, we've struggled to get there. There was always some limitation. And it seems right now the promise of AI to actually truly deliver on that is possible.
You can't get there with a rules-based system. You just end up with spaghetti.
Well, anyone who's built very complex nurturing journeys know that there's eventual breakdown. The more personalized you want to get, there's only so many if-then statements and branching logic things you can do before it gets to be too complicated. And it doesn't actually still address what it is you're trying to do. I wanted to ask, for our listeners who are like, okay, what does this mean to me right now? How can I move my organization from this idea of marketing qualified leads towards something that will help us address some of the most common mistakes you've seen or noticed teams are making when they move away from this MQL logic?
Well, the common mistakes are first doing it alone without full alignment and buy-in from the rest of the executive team. The single best thing I think that the CMO can do is to enlist the head of sales and also the head of post-sale, if they exist, basically propose the new set of metrics, as a team. So that's number one. I think number two, regardless, is when you start changing these things, is set the expectation that the quantity is likely to go down. The quality will go up and the conversion rate will go up, right? But if people don't expect that just the numbers will be lower, you can run into a buzzsaw and get into trouble. What I recommend is that CMOs be very thoughtful about their measurement architecture. And we actually published a research report about the strategic CMO on the B2B CMO project website. We talked about three types of CMO dashboards. The first is, what do you show to the board, right? And literally at the board level, and these really should be business outcomes. So first off, I think the best strategic CMOs own pipeline, right? So they report on pipeline created, new and expansion across all sources. And that last piece is the key. You're not reporting on a marketing source or sales source. You're reporting on, is there enough pipeline for the business? Because at the end of the day, if there is, the board doesn't care who sourced it. And if you believe in complex nonlinear buying processes, trying to actually track where that deal came from is a fool's errand. From there, marketing can report on, can share in the reporting of some other key metrics, like opportunity win rates, net revenue retention, a customer acquisition cost. And then the last one I talked to for CMOs at the board level is marketing efficiency, which is the total pipeline generated per dollar of marketing investment. Right. So that's your top level. Your second level are now your CEO and CFO level indicators. And this is where things like hand raisers and MQAs can kick in. Some things like pipeline quality and brand health would sort of make sense. But then you save everything else for marketing and the marketing team's operational metrics, including the MEA that we talked about, that third level of market development metrics, account engagement, even like program performance. That all is important stuff, but does not belong in your CEO or board level reports.
If you could go back and had someone give you advice to help point out to you what you might do differently, what advice would you give a CMO who's ready to make the shift?
Well, I think some of the things I already said around building a committee, working with your peers, I think all that is really, really important. But if I were going to then maybe sort of try to narrow it down to any one thing, it's really try to earn your seat by being a business executive first. Surface problems in marketing and in the market before other people do. That builds a lot of credibility. Spend a lot of time with your peers. The CRO, the CFO, understand their challenges, and then you are in a better position to demonstrate how marketing helps, not marketing, but helps them, and own the customer voice. I alluded to this earlier, but that is the single most powerful thing that the chief market officer can bring to have these strategic discussions. I think if you are a strategic CMO that is established that level of credibility, people aren't going to question what metrics you're reporting, if it's MQLs or MQAs or anything else, because they know you're a strategic part of the leadership.
Excellent advice, John. We've covered what I hoped we would today. This is so important. As the buying dynamics have changed, people need to approach things differently. And what I think you've talked about is going to help many people start thinking about, how do you start addressing the 95% who aren't in market? Our listeners today, we're going to be sharing the resource that John shared in the show notes. John, I want to say thank you for joining us today. Be excited to see how things develop as you progress with Phave. And I'm really glad you could be on the show with us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.